I'd like to go back to Bob and Betsy again to ask them in the process of building this amazing collection, was there a philosophy, an underlying raison d'etre that you had to focus in what you were buying? In other words, were you interested in building a comprehensive collection of Edo painting, or were you more motivated by what made your heart go pitter-pat with your own personal taste? And if that's the case, how has that taste changed in the course of collecting for 40 years?
Well, Joan, when we started collecting paintings, buying paintings in the early 70s, we really had no intention whatsoever of creating any substantial collection, much less a comprehensive one. In the 1970s, Bob and I were young professionals living in Manhattan on a shoestring budget. And though Japanese scroll paintings were exciting and a new fascination, we had very limited knowledge and even less money with which to acquire them. Even so, over the next few years, we continued to look at Edo art, and on occasional visits to dealers' showrooms, began to find a few works that we liked and could afford. And it's fascinating to look back at what we chose right at the beginning and compare them to the works that we bought from that point on. We had developed a few close relationships with dealers in Japan and had a little bit more money and a lot more experience as time went on. Now I will let Bob continue from there.
One of our earliest purchases was this Cascade in Summer Mountains by Nakabayashi Chikuto, who lived from 1776 to 1853. As a budding young artist, Chikuto was supported by a wealthy Nagoya collector of Chinese paintings. So it was quite natural that he derived his artistic style from the Chinese school of literati painters. The literati were intellectuals who, having mastered calligraphy, the skill of writing in ink with a brush, believed they should also be adept at the other core traditional arts, writing poetry and making paintings. At age 24, Chikuto moved to Kyoto, where he lived for 50 years, teaching and writing treatises on Chinese-style painting. He was renowned for his bird and flower painting and his innumerable ink landscapes, of which this is a simple but evocative example. Now, contrast this with this huge Chinese landscape on a two-fold screen we acquired 30 years later. This is the most beautiful and fully realized ink landscape I have ever seen by Chikuto, perhaps his landscape masterpiece. Most of his ink landscapes contain no images of people at all, but this huge vista is built around the traveler in the lower right-hand corner, which you can see crossing a bridge over a stream flowing from the waterfalls in the distant mountains. The man is coming to visit a friend, waiting for him in his elevated lake house in the center of the work, giving this painting the sense of human story in addition to its monumental vistas. We are evidently freezing frequently, and we apologize for that.
There you are.
If we can go on to the next slide. This was a very early painting that we bought by Matsumura Keibun, who lived 1779 to 1843, called Cherry Blossoms and Bird. Matsumura Keibun lived in Kyoto, where he studied with his older brother, Matsumura Goshin, who was himself a successful painter, but 27 years Keibun's senior. Keibun also studied with Maruyama Okyo, the founder of the Maruyama Shijo school, the so-called realist school of painters of the Edo period. From 1818 until his death in 1843, Keibun was one of Kyoto's leading artists, securely establishing the Shijo school there after his brother's death in 1811. He was especially noted for his bird and flower paintings, of which this is a graceful but small example. 25 years later, we were offered this amazing painting of a peacock and peonies by Keibun's great teacher, Maruyama Okyo. The skill with which Okyo has depicted the peacock and his tail is matched by the expense of the pigments he used: gold paint and ground semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli. Occhio made 3 such paintings of peacocks, of which this is the second largest. The first painting, just a bit bigger, is owned by the Emperor of Japan. Let's go to the next slide, please. A prolific designer, Ogata Korin is known as the 17th century founder of the Rinpa school of painting, along with Tawaraya Sotatsu and Honami Koetsu. The Rinpa school is, in fact, named for him. Here, he's painted the Chinese mendicant monk Chi Tzu, or Hotei in Japanese, who died in the year 916. Historical sources describe Hotei as unfailingly good-humored, fond of practical jokes, with a pot belly and an equally large sack in which he collected his alms and carried his few belongings scavenged during his endless wanderings. He came to be regarded in Japan as the patron saint of children, and being careless of physical needs and indifferent to authority was thought of as leading a true Zen lifestyle. Here, with masterful simplicity of line, Korin has painted Hotei reclining against his bag of goodies, smiling contentedly out at the rest of us hard-working fools. After Korin's death in the early 18th century, his glorious style of painting went into near eclipse, to be rescued and hugely expanded by Sakai Hoitsu and Suzuki Kiitsu 50 years later. A generation before them, however, Tawaraya Sori, a painter about whom almost nothing is known, and let's move to the slide next, about whom almost nothing is known, including the dates of his birth and death, painted this famous small 6-fold screen of autumn maples on gold leaf papers. It's a Rinpa school landmark, known to every scholar of Edo period art. It's been shown in at least 12 major exhibitions in the past 40 years and appears in at least 11 major Japanese publications on Rinpa painting. We were extraordinarily lucky to have been offered it by a dealer who kept it out of circulation for a year until we could come to Japan to see it. So, as you can see, even with inexperienced eyes and minimal knowledge, we managed to choose a few worthwhile paintings early on. They were simpler works by important painters, but still good enough to remain in the collection and compete with the best today. I'm proud of the fact that Betsy and I made the choices of what to purchase by ourselves, without counsel from our many knowledgeable friends. We traveled in Japan alone, and we made our own choices. So, Joan, you asked how the collection came to be so comprehensive. Simply put, that was the result of collecting paintings over an almost 50-year period of time. As we hunted for paintings in Japan, we were introduced to artists we'd never heard of and discussed their relationship to ones that we knew. Nanga artists, for instance, who painted together at drunken evening parties. Successful students of Maruyama Shijo masters. Talented young apprentices who were adopted by painters just to carry on their work and continue their family names after their deaths. Over the years, we found paintings that illustrated those connections, and in addition, expressed our own maturing acceptances of styles that earlier on we had not properly understood. And as the range of our taste expanded, we filled in the gaps between the acknowledged masters, still choosing only paintings we found evocative and beautiful ourselves. So the collection's comprehensiveness came with increasing knowledge over many years, certainly not by intent or careful planning.
Wonderful, thank you. I've been lucky enough to be with you when you've made a few acquisitions. And I love it when you and Bob, you and Betsy are together and a scroll gets unrolled and you start cursing. God Damn it. That's Bob's first reaction when he sees something wonderful that unfortunately he's going to have to get out his checkbook and pay for. You're cursing at the same time. There's ecstatic joy written all over your face. A pleasure to see. And we are all the witnesses to the success of that. So let us turn to Sebastian. If you're still with us, Sebastian, we haven't forgotten you. I have a question for you. In the more than 40 years that both you and I have been working in the field of Japanese art, what changes, as both an auction house expert as well as a dealer yourself, have you seen in the marketplace for Japanese painting, particularly in the United States, in these 4 decades? Sebastian. Sebastian, are you there? You were there.
Am I here? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? All right. So in answer to your question, I have been closely involved with Japanese art for 40 years, beginning in December 1980 when I joined Christie's New York as the head of their Japanese art department. And for the last 22 years on my own as an independent dealer, as an appraiser. Things are very different now than they were when I joined Christie's. At that time, Japanese painting was not one of the areas that the auction houses focused. Both Sotheby's and Christie's catered to the large numbers of collectors of Japanese works of art, such as porcelain and lacquer, Meiji decorative arts, prints, netsuke and inro, swords and fittings, that created a thriving auction market. Japanese paintings in the form of screens were also handled, but while both houses occasionally sold scroll paintings, there was not much expertise, and collectors such as Bob and Betsy were very much left alone to develop their own tastes. Treasures, sometimes recognized, sometimes not, did pass through our hands. So sharp-eyed dealers and perceptive collectors followed our auctions and attended them. Scroll paintings and screens sourced in Japan and elsewhere tended to be handled by private dealers, both American and Japanese, who catered to the Feinbergs and to other American collectors such as Mary and Jackson Burke. And Joan, you were one of those. Mateus Como was another. Harry Packard was one. Joseph Sayo was one. Leighton Lonke and Fred Bakeland. There is an adage that art follows money. And as the 80s progressed, increased wealth in Japan meant that the auctions now became full of Japanese dealers, taking advantage of local ignorance to buy art and to return to clients in Japan. As market prices rose, the auction houses soon realized that they needed to improve the professionalism by hiring consultants, and paintings, now part of an expanding market, began to be treated more seriously. Higher prices soon resulted. I think these years must have been very trying ones for American collectors, since competition was fierce and price inflation was pronounced and much material returned to Japan. But I do remember that the Feinbergs bought, when I was at Christie's, a beautiful Toyoharu 2-panel screen, which I found in the gazebo of somebody's swimming pool, the changing room beside somebody's swimming pool in Los Angeles. And it was a great discovery. But I think at the time, much material returned to Japan. I think also that collectors at this time responded by developing interests in fields that the mainline museums and buyers in Japan were not ready yet for. Hence the interest in the various schools of 17th, 18th, and 19th century Edo painting. At the same time, this was all taking place, and here I'm only talking about the situation in New York. Institutions such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Asia Society, and the Japan Society Gallery, flush with support from the Japan Foundation and support from the Monbusho, held numerous groundbreaking exhibitions of Japanese art, allowing a much greater awareness of the subject among the American public, as well as stimulating studies by specialists. Of course, in the 90s, after the real estate collapse in Japan, the market changed again, and now Japanese paintings began to flood out of Japan to the West. At this point, mature collectors, such as Bob and Betsy, were ready for the challenge, and it must have been a very exciting period for them indeed. Now the auction houses were able to source material in Japan itself, bringing many treasures directly to buyers. Not only did the collapse of private museums in Japan bring out much new material, but from the late 70s, American scholarship in the field had also advanced, and this knowledge underpinned adventurous acquisitions on the part of collectors and gave them a much better understanding of the field. In my own specialist area of ukiyo-e paintings, American collectors now had opportunities that had not been seen in 100 years. And I'm sure that this is the same case with other areas of Edo painting. For American collectors and the general public, Edo painting remains the most accessible of the painting schools of Japan. Bob and Betsy have successfully set out to build a choice collection representative of most styles and schools, and have established a yardstick that later collectors will have to measure themselves against. In short, perhaps the greatest change in the field over the past 40 or 50 years has been the willingness of certain collectors to specialize in particular areas in order to build depth, whether in specific artists, for example, Kei and Tom Edson's collection of Shibata Zeshin, an example which I showed you just now, or the comprehensive ukiyo-e collections of a school. Robert Weston's collection of ukiyo-e paintings comes to mind. Or Bob and Betsy's fine collection of later Rimpa painting. These last 40 years must have been quite an adventure for the Feinbergs, and I cannot think of anything more satisfactory than seeing your achievements so well housed and presented and available for future generations of students to study and admire than the splendid exhibition currently on display at the Harvard Art Museums.
Thank you, Sebastian. That's incredibly well said, and you summarized those 40 years brilliantly. I agree with virtually everything you said.
Sure.
And it was a treat to be at the exhibition at the same time, you and I, and getting to see these former friends now in their new home. And,
the wonderful Utamara painting that belonged to, that actually was sold at Park Burnett in 1946. So things, what comes around, thing. But anyway, it's a beautiful painting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sebastian.